This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Joe Whitworth. Joe is the president and CEO of the Freshwater Trust, an innovative and action-oriented conservation organization whose mission is to preserve and restore freshwater ecosystems. With a focus on technology and an all-star staff made up of scientists, attorneys, GIS experts, systems analysts, and more, the Freshwater Trust is pioneering the next generation of conservation by focusing on quantifiable results. Back when I was a conservation director here in Colorado, I had the great pleasure of partnering with the Freshwater Trust on a project involving water rights and irrigated farmland, and I was blown away by the organization's ability to quickly put complex ideas into action for the benefit of land, water, and communities. Joe was born into a large midwestern family, and from an early age, his grandfather, who was a farmer, played a foundational role in his understanding of land, water, and conservation. After high school, Joe moved east to attend Dartmouth, where he played football, and then he eventually moved west to attend law school. Along the way, he began to focus his professional efforts on doing work that made the world a better place. After several stints at several different organizations, he took the reins of the organization that would eventually become the Freshwater Trust. Joe has now been at the helm of the Freshwater Trust for more than 2 decades, and he's grown the organization's budget tenfold during his tenure. He's focused, action-oriented, innovative, and very serious about solving big, complex conservation problems in the West and beyond. As you'll hear, Joe and I share many common interests in everything from history to reading to conservation to rivers. And perhaps more importantly, I connect deeply with many of Joe's core values around hard work, following your own path, and taking action. So it's no surprise that we had such a fun conversation. We started out talking about Joe's grandfather, Joe's journey from the Midwest to the Ivy League, and how he adjusted to life at Dartmouth. We talked about his early years of working as a nonprofit consultant, as well as the series of events that led him to the Freshwater Trust. We talk about the ultimatum that led to the Freshwater Trust's impressive growth, the type of people who thrive as staff members, and he gives an overview of their BasinScout technology. We discuss the future of environmentalism, technology's role in solving environmental challenges, favorite books, and much more. As I said, I've been a fan of the Freshwater Trust for many years, so I was glad to finally have the opportunity to chat with Joe about his personal and professional journeys. Hope you enjoy. Joe, I'm so excited to be chatting with you. I'm, as we talked maybe a month or two ago on the phone and had a super long conversation. We should have just recorded that, but I've both worked with the Freshwater Trust professionally, and then we got a bunch of mutual friends, and then we got a bunch of mutual interest in reading and history and outdoor stuff. So as is always the case, it's going to be tough to just keep this to about an hour, but I was wondering, I want to get into all the work that Freshwater Trust is doing, but I also feel like you have such an interesting backstory of how you came to this work. And so I was wondering if you could just start out by talking a bit about your grandfather and the influence he had on you as a kid and as it's kind of progressed into this amazing career you've built.
First off, thanks for having me. It's always good to have a conversation. In terms of podcasting, I always like to be the one asking questions, so I may turn the tables on you at some point. but grew up in the Midwest at the confluence of Illinois, Missouri, and Mississippi systems, and spent most of my summers we were the first generation off the farm, spent most of the summers up on the farm. And so, Dad was a carpenter and Grandpa was a farmer. And those two really came together to give me, I think, what now is, it's my context, my operating context. And, Grandpa was the kind of guy who, after working all day, would go down to the lower fields after supper and unwind by, hoeing weeds in the lower bean ground. And, as a little dude, I would always just, go along with him, anything to hang out with Grandpa. And, he used to say this thing, no man has the right to take more from the land than the land can take. And I had no idea what he was talking about, just none. But he said it enough times that it really did stick with me. And it's an ethos that's shared by many farmers. And so, you go on throughout your life. And one of the things that was interesting, after I'd gone through school, not quite through law school, and, that river, it was called Blackbird Creek, that ran, the length of part of his fields was declared impaired under the Clean Water Act due to agricultural runoff. And I'm like, well, that doesn't sort of square with what my grandpa, and I know what his neighbors would think.
Yeah.
And they were taking more. Anyway, it was a situation where either grandpa was a liar or the system was set up wrong. And I determined that he wasn't a liar. And the system, this global commodity system wherein these individual farmers are operating, it's well beyond their control. And so the incentives are set up wrong. And how do we, get those right has really become kind of the focus of my work at the Freshwater Trust over these many years now.
So you went east for undergrad and then you went west for law school. When you were in high school, say, did you have inkling that you wanted to devote your career to conservation, or if not, when did that kind of click in for you?
Well, inklings are tough and sometimes pretty small. I grew up, Dad was a carpenter. So the other part of that earlier piece is I spent my summers, a lot of them bucking hay, but the other part of the time I spent my summers on a roof, in the Mississippi River Valley, at 100 degrees and 98% humidity. And so I did this and I was the youngest of three boys in a 6-kid family. And I never got to move up the corporate ladder. Every job we'd go on to, I would be like, okay, which horrible job do I get to do this week? But I did see one of the things that I did learn. Well, I learned two big things. The first one was, watching Dad at the end of his day, he would, after we'd come off the job, we would go visit the neighbors that invariably came over to ask him what was going on and how that works, how the roof gets done. And they had a job. Could he come and look? And so he would go listen to their problem. He would give them a bid. And then the next week we'd show up at their place and we would work there until the job was done and done right. And that I saw that happen every week throughout my childhood. I started working for him in 4th grade for $1 a day.
Wow.
And that you see that happen enough times, you just had this idea that you identify a problem, and then you identify your solution and you work till it's done. That's it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was a great lesson. That one didn't really dawn on me until much later. The big takeaway at the age, by the time I was in high school was like, I really don't want to make a living off my back.
Yeah.
And, my dad worked the day that he died. And that is, it's hard work. And I decided that I wanted to go, go to college, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I thought I was going to be, I was going to go to med school like everybody else that matriculates freshman year. Cause I had broken my femur as a freshman in high school and was fascinated by the process of healing that and getting, back into my sports, which were.
How'd you do that?
Well, the femur break actually happened late in football season, and it wasn't football related outside. I was with some guys on the team over at somebody's farm and around Halloween, and we decided to take a ride through a pumpkin patch on a 3-wheeler with a broken headlight. And, before I knew it, all I saw was a flash of orange, and then was looking up at the moon on my back. And I looked just right over to my right ear and I saw my Chuck Taylor right there. So yeah, your reaction is the one that my buddy had. He just about passed. He said, "You look like a broken spider on the ground." Anyway, got out of that and got into it. And the doctor, Fred Grandia was his name. And I remember he was the first man that I ever seen cuss in front of my mom. Which I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
This guy's legit if he thinks he can get away with that. Anyway, he went to Wash U in St. Louis. I was going to go there and play basketball and football. And the dude, Fred Remy, took a job at Brown, coaching football, told me that he's like, I would love to have you come out here, Joe, but I'm full up. I'm going to send your tape. And at that time, it was literally one VHS tape, which was everything they had on me. And he sent it around, to several Ivy League schools. And you got to remember, I am from nowhere.
Yeah.
Like,
oh yeah.
I thought we were pretty well to do, but I think Dad made $25,000 in his best year
with six kids.
Yeah.
Oof,
and so I didn't know we were poor, but, and I didn't really realize that until later. But the first time I was on, by the force of that one VHS tape sent around to football offices, I ended up on the first aeroplane I had ever flown, flying into New York City from, Woodrow, Illinois. And I was convinced that we were going to crash. And how could these people be so calm? Nothing this big can stay in the air this long. Look at all those buildings. We're going down. And then I proceeded to take a whole bunch of other visits and end up, talking to my dad on on the back porch. And I remember, saying, Dad, I don't know too much about stuff. It seems like these Ivy League schools are a thing. Altogether, it'll probably cost our family about $10,000, over the 4 years, which I know is a lot of money, Dad. I don't know how we'll come up with that. And he said, you can go with Buddy Tevens was the guy who came to our house twice, and he was the coach. He's recently passed away, but he's like, go with that Tevens guy. He's got it. And I was like, all right. And that was it. And that, that going to a place like that completely changed the trajectory of my life. Probably the luckiest thing that's ever happened to me.
What was that like when you rolled in there? Because I would imagine, I don't know. When did you graduate high school?
I graduated in 87.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would think that they're, rolling in there from a big family that didn't make a lot of money. And then you're rolling in there. And I would imagine there could be quite a culture shock, because I know there are a bunch of, that's a Northeastern school with a bunch of wealthy kids coming from, prep schools and all that kind of stuff. I mean, how was that adjustment for you?
There's definitely prep school influence. There's definitely old money there. And of course, old money has the good manners to not point out that you don't have money. But more than that, I think that that I got to go, we had to turn up and report for football camp, in early August. And so, the place was empty, and, we rolled into, 2 or 3 weeks of practice before anybody else turned up. And the cool thing about that sport, and honestly, the cool thing about all sports, is if you do your job on the field, nobody cares where you're from or how much you make or, what color your skin is. It doesn't matter. If you do your job, then I'm with you and you're with me, and that's it. And so I became, you have almost like, 60 baked in friends, straight away. And, my dad ended up dying freshman spring, and that group of friends, I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that they saved my life. They formed a protective shield around me and, convinced me that I was like, I got to go back and save the family construction business. Is that what I'm supposed to do? And they're like, no, dummy, that's not, no. You need to stay here and then figure out what you're going to do. But, they were also, these weren't kind of your typical knuckleheads. We talked about the world and ideas, and particularly after Dad passed, I got a lot more serious about, things that seemed really important to me prior to that became far less important to me. And it began to center on, well, you get a chance like this, you gotta help people. You gotta you don't waste this. And so that kind of freed me up to do all kinds of things and entertain all kinds of ideas. And that has made a big difference. It's made the difference in my life, probably.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, because it makes everything, to me at least, in my weird brain, makes everything makes so much more sense. Because, as you know, when we talked a few weeks back, and then in my preparation for this conversation, you strike me as somebody that is very serious about what they're doing, and you approach your work with, we talked about this on the phone, with a level of aggression. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it in the most complimentary way possible. I mean, the time is of the essence. We got important stuff to do, but behind it all is this real desire to make the world a better place and to help people. It's not, I'm going to be aggressive so I can take everybody else's money and win, quote. It's this aggression to make the world better. So I really appreciate you sharing all that. So you graduate Dartmouth, then what?
Well, I grew up in the Midwest. I went to school out east. I'm going west, right?
Nice.
That's the obvious. Isn't that the obvious? So I'm like, well, I need some cash. So, I went through the corporate recruiting process, and I had some jobs in, offers in New York, and then, in the Midwest, and they didn't quite did the bill what I was looking for. And I didn't really, my organizing principle is I want to help people. And which is, seems very specific when you're, 22 years old, but it's pretty broad.
Yeah.
But the wardrobes that I tried on in New York and, sort of corporate Midwest didn't sort of fit. So I'm like, okay, I gotta go keep going, see what happens. First needed some money, went home, roofed for a couple weeks, had $1,400, figured that ought to do it. headed to San Francisco. Ended up tending bar for a while at a place called Harry Denton's. It was a jazz bar, kind of the yachting set came through there. It's pretty funny. So I worked the door for a while and, graduated to barkeep. But then ultimately, we were living in Palo Alto, with a handful of dudes that, baseball and football guys, Dartmouth guys. And we primarily were doing that because Bobby Clark, who was, a great Scottish soccer player who ran our fitness stuff during college, the morning after drinking nights at 7 a.m. You create a special relationship with a guy like that. But anyway, the reason we chose Palo Alto, you had a couple of guys working in Silicon Valley, a couple of guys working up in San Fran, and it was, in the middle, plus we had free access to the Stanford facilities.
Nice.
So that was, that's what we did. And I guess I got to the point where, you realize you need to kind of start moving on and living on ramen and, not much else is a pretty good indicator. So I ended up falling in with a consulting group, that consulted to not-for-profits, an outfit called Community Counseling Service. They've since changed their name to CCS. And they, I was then put on the tour of doing feasibility studies and capital campaigns, working with boards and volunteers. I was out of the Midwest division and, so worked with schools, churches, hospitals, you name it, to kind of live out their, sort of help them pursue their mission. And I just learned a ton at a very young age about how people move to action.
Yeah.
And make the world a better place. So that was another fantastic set of applied experiences that gave me a perspective of, okay, so you got to get people to move, not because you make them, but because they want to. And I began to understand the mechanics of that and all the other pieces. But I lived in like 6 or 7 towns in 3 years, which was in itself cool. But I would, finish a job on Friday, and I'd be on a plane on Monday to the next spot and lived there for 3 to 6 months. And it became a fairly mercenary existence. And it's about that time, Dartmouth reached out to me and said, we're doing this capital campaign here. Would you be interested in serving as an officer in the alumni fund? And at that point, I was very interested in doing something that I cared about, that animated me. And it was pretty easy to think about, if my work there for the college could help some kid from Corn Patch, Illinois, go to a place like that, I am all in. That is a worthy thing, and I'll do it. So I went back there and did that for a few years before heading back to law school.
Well, I mean, was there ever a point? I mean, I imagine in the consulting world, that's making good money, but it's not like, Deloitte or McKinsey or kind of money. I mean, was there ever a point where you not wavered, but maybe second guessed, like, oh man, maybe I should just be focused on making as much money as I can versus the whole trying to help people? Or was that pretty locked in from the, after freshman year?
It was, I lived like a monk. Because I did, Dad died, freshman year. And when I needed $300, Mom would send me 30. And so I got caught. I had to kind of self-finance, in, leveraging credit cards and so forth. So I literally lived like a monk. But if anything, that by that time I was starting to chase something and understand that I've just seen a whole bunch of different models being applied and poorly executed on, to be honest, within the leadership of a lot of these nonprofits. And it really pissed me off, like not in a I'm mad way, but there's so much wasted potential here. And there is one thing that motivates me, and it's wasted potential. I often reflected on kind of where in my hometown, a fantastic job is to be a welder. And those are good jobs, don't get me wrong, but very, very few people make it out of there alive. And I have 3 siblings that didn't make it out of there alive. Right. And so that, to me, I'm like, golly, there's just so much here. And, it kind of came down to when I grew up, I'm going to keep on sharpening my skills and burning off the baby fat of my ideas so that I can be a high value player at, some organization that is trying to do something that's deeply aligned with what I want to do. And of course, Dartmouth was one of those places. I mean, it's done so many great things over its history. But it wasn't probably going to be Dartmouth, but I hadn't figured out what it was going to be. And so that was I'm still chasing, it kind of felt like I'm, honing it down. I think that if you look at my resume now on a piece of paper, you're like, wow, this is pretty linear. But this, and anybody who's gone through life is like, well, yeah, it didn't really feel linear. And, so I walked into Dartmouth and I was like, hey man, I'm going to be a surgeon. I'm going to be an orthoped. It's going to be cool. And what you realize looking back is, just nothing about nothing at that age. And what you do is you go through life, and as you do things, you say, well, 80% of this was great, and 20% of that I never want to do again. And that holds true through your professional career. And you just whittle those 20% off. And all of a sudden I was, kind of like my late 20s. I'm like, you know what? This kind of looks like an arrow. And now I know where I'm going to aim it. And that's when I started leading into conservation, and specifically water.
I love that. And I think that's a really, really important lesson for people to get out of this episode, because I say the same thing, but not as eloquently as you did, but none of it makes sense going forward, at least in the beginning. I mean, none of it. And, none of it. And I mean, and you hear that across the board. I just love memoirs. I love biographies. I love interviews. And you talk to anybody that seems to have landed somewhere interesting, and there was definitely a time where they had no idea where it was going. So for anybody who's thinking that, you're not alone, obviously. And if you don't take my word for it, take Joe's word for it.
Yeah, well, it's a little crazy. I mean, the world is designed to make you shut up and get in line.
I agree.
And, every time to be honest, every time I've thought about getting in line, it really comes down to I was tired. Right? Like, yeah, maybe standing in line or swimming upstream. I could see one's easier than the other. Maybe I'll just go stand in line. And then, you just have to find a way to recharge and reset yourself so you can, you take on the next trial. And, it was funny. I mean, I don't know what I was chasing exactly, but I knew that getting in line wasn't it.
Well, and then I think you can zoom out on that. We'll talk about that more, but on an organizational level, I think there are all these, particularly in the nonprofit space, people that are following the same playbook, and it's very easy just to follow that playbook and kind of do what everybody else is doing. But then, what you and your team at the Freshwater Trust have done is you're not in line. You're doing your own thing. You've invented a whole new way about going about this stuff. That's very, very important. So when did Freshwater Trust enter your consciousness?
Freshwater Trust is two organizations brought together in 2008 across 08 and into, 09 when we merged them and rebranded them all into the Freshwater Trust. But, when I got to Oregon, Liz Whitworth, my wife now I should have never started that sentence. 25, 20, we were married in 1997. We got married in Lawrence, Kansas, because she was in public health school and I was in law school there. It's literally the cheapest law school in the country, $6,000 a year.
Really?
Or it was at the time. And I figured, I do want to go to law school, but I was never going to practice law. And so I didn't want to come out of there with debt because I'd already seen that movie and I didn't like it.
Yep.
So we ended up Kansas, but we were, pretty quickly, Liz was a little nonplussed by life in the Midwest. And, I remember she said, a lot of these people just don't talk. And I was like, well, as a native son of the Midwest, I'm like, well, what's there to talk about? Which didn't help my cause. But anyway, we ended up coming west and I took a job at Outward Bound and then
I didn't realize that.
Rematriculated to Lewis and Clark because by that time I'd figured out I was going to be environmental law.
Okay.
And so we ended up, moving out here. And, I was working full time and schooling full time, which, thank goodness for caffeine. Otherwise that wouldn't have gone down.
Tell the story that when we talked on the phone the other day about when you initially got the job at Freshwater Trust or at the organization that was to become Freshwater Trust. And then there was, and you took a look at how things were going and just made the decision, we're going to have to revamp things, which may be an understatement.
Yeah. Looking back now, there are a few things that are harder in the world than running a smaller, less than $1 million organization. And the organization was then called Oregon Trout, and we were the first wild fish group in the Pacific Northwest. Said the words wild fish. Also listed several of the first Pacific salmon under the Endangered Species Act. Helped launch the Oregon Water Trust and create the in-stream water right. And established a salmon restoration fund that at that time was, larger investment than we'd been making in the Everglades. Mm-hmm. So great organization, innovative. And, I walked in the door and we were roughly, I think we were 9 people and an operating budget about $700,000 and a lot of caffeine. right? And a very traditional conservation advocacy group at that time. And we had gone through a couple of sort of litigation processes. And one of the things, for example, that we did, which was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, was, we shortened a gillnet fishery season from 30 days to 20 days in the main stem Columbia. And, these are, salmon populations that are flickering at, 3-4% of historic abundance, and 10 days ain't going to fix, it's not going to help them really. And the effort that we spent to get that shift was just too much. And, I was smoked. I mean, I was, like I say, there's running $1 million nonprofit is just a fate that I do not wish upon anyone. And I laud everybody out there that's doing it. But I went to I did my homework. What I always do before going to the board is I do some writing to put a harder edge on the questions that I'm asking and the options that I'm seeing, and really become a consultant to the organization. And I went into the board meeting and I said, look, when we started this, we were one of one. There were no other groups out there doing this kind of stuff. And we have had a fantastic record of going 0 to 1 in all these things that we've done. Our 0 to 1 created a lot of handfolds for a lot of other groups that can come up and do mostly the work that we're doing. And while I think we're the best, operators among them, I also know that they're probably getting, 85 to 90% done just as well as we could. So here's my recommendation. Either we, invest in the organization and really focus in on our most valuable traits. And I have a plan to do that. I think we can grow into like a $3 million powerhouse that focused on, large scale restoration and education, applied education, barring from my outward bound world, the experiential stuff, tied to state science benchmarks, and, our rifled policy advocacy. And if you don't want to do that, here's the plan, here's the price tag. And if you don't want to do that, here are the 15 steps to wind down business. And I honestly, I don't care what you pick. I'm too tired to care at this point, but you have to pick. And, we threw it around. We have a great set of advisors. We historically have had a fantastic set of advisors, and they, looked at it on the merits and they said, okay, we're going to invest. We raised, a little more than $1 million, and off we took. And that led us to our next trial.
Wait, and so when you laid that out, how old were you then? 34, 35?
No, I wasn't quite. No, I was 32 maybe. It was less than 2 years into the job.
I mean, this is one of those things. It's kind of like how everything lines up when you look backwards and everything made perfect sense. And I think stories like this, they're really fun to hear, and they sound great. But I would guess, tell me, I could be wrong, but I would guess there were some of the board members were slack jawed. Like, this guy's crazy. Like, what is he talking about?
Well, there was a board meeting, before that. And we had, like I said, we have always had fantastic board members. Sometimes they haven't knowledge, skills, and abilities lined up with exactly what our future was going to be. So much as what our recent past had been. So we had honestly a heavy legal component. We had to cartoon a little bit, if you were a tweed jacket with elbow patches and a pipe wearing fly fisher, you had a pretty good shot at being on our board when I walked in the door. Right. And we had some awesome ones, no doubt about it, but they would argue entire board meetings about, where to put a comma in the wild fish policy.
Yeah.
And it's like, where are we going here? And so my second board meeting, and I knew having worked with boards, I'm like, I don't have a lot of time. If I need to transmogrify this board, I got to get on the stick here. And so my second board meeting, I was talking about my, kind of where I see this organization going. And one of the points, probably the most important point that I had, given our size and the operating context, was we need to increase the caliber of our board. Full stop. Awkward silence, a little rustling around. And I never forget Paul Fortino, who is a real hotshot attorney out of, for an outfit called Perkins Coie, which is a pretty big outfit. He clears his throat, and he's like a world-class litigator. He's the guy that keeps his clients were CEOs whose names didn't want to be in the paper over various things. He's kind of a fixer, and he clears his throat. He goes, Joe, when you say increase the caliber of our board, what do you mean? And I'm like, shit. I'm like, I got one shot. I'm like, here's our prototype CEO. Full stop. And he just nodded his head. And that's like 20 years ago. And Fortino, to his credit, is still on our board. He's now of counsel, and is one of the great advisors, across the span of my life, of which I have several. But, we have more CEOs and less lawyers than we did at that time. So long story to your short question, but basically they were used to me laying it on the line. That's the one thing. Like I had, we also had to ultimately cut the education program. The right way to say it is transition the education program.
That's consultant speak.
Yeah, right. But I mean, it was like we literally in about 2010, we by that time we had found our way to technology. Yeah. We had secured as a graduation requirement in our home state of Oregon, kind of an environmental education tied to state science benchmarks. So we were never going to be able to get to every student in the state. That got us to every student in the state. It was, no child left inside act. And what I did was, I mean, we had needing, technology is a forever game. And I was in process of learning that. But I was just looking at, because all of these great mission driven organizations at the end of the day, they're just enterprises. And, they don't run on ideas, they run on cash. And so I'm looking at this and I'm like, we're spending more than half of our, sort of our fundraising effort on what is equivalent to about 10% of our budget. And that's a bad one. So, in a day, like I had made, when I was at Outward Bound, I saw some very hard questions being ducked because it's tough to make hard calls. And I was not in a position, I ultimately I was director of operations there, and, it wasn't my call. I could provide input, but it wasn't my call. And I provided the input that was very clear and demonstrated where it would go if you didn't make the call. And I saw 2 or 3 of those just ducked. And that killed me. And I made a promise to myself that if I ever get to a position, when I'm running something, if I ever get to a position where the right answer is obvious, if I do not make that call, then I need to resign, because fidelity to the mission overrides anything affiliated with my own comfort. You have to, I think that's why so many efforts, so much money, so much effort has been spent, not on pursuit of the original objectives, that that's just not okay with me. So anyway, I got to that place, and I said, once I did that, it was a matter of, the most expensive time that a leader has is, the time between the moment they know they have to do something and the moment they do it. And the longer you wait, the more expensive, not just in dollars, but in all sort of units of measure. And so, that one we had to do. But again, when I presented the case to the board, I'm like, look, I didn't go to the board in that case and say, I'm thinking about doing this. And I did it, I just made the call, made the preparations and did it. And, then explained the reasoning after, because I knew that, some board members would not be, we would end up having some watered down version of that action that would ultimately bleed us out. And that was, the technology piece was going, and that was showing promise. Even though I didn't understand it, I knew enough that thing is a rocket ship and we have to get on without any drag coefficients. Right. And our education, though worthy. I mean, it was fantastic. I could talk for hours about that program, but it was better. We spun it off to Oregon State University, and they've done a great job working with other partners to keep it going to this day. But the need to do it was undeniable. So, I went and, did the action. We cut the organization in half in a single day by transitioning the education department. But in 2 years it doubled, and then 2 more years it doubled again. And then in 2 more years it doubled again. And not that size is a signifier of, success, but it is a signifier of growth and strength. And, our impact is, has extended from that. And it really did go, because of, those decisions you make, around the organization and its ability to function correctly and efficiently.
I love that. This isn't a question. It's more of a observation, but I feel like you balance this. It's a really unique mix of confidence without arrogance, and I think that's a very tough balance to find. I think, because sometimes people bleed over in the arrogance and it's so off-putting, but in all of our conversations and this one, you just strike me as very well prepared, very hardworking, and the decisions you're making are based on data and experience, and I think people yearn for that confidence, versus wishy-washy stuff. So humble people don't like to respond to stuff like that. So I'm just going to ask the next question.
I was going to say, it's ridiculous.
So let's get into the technology, because I personally, when I was at Palmer Land Conservancy, we partnered with the Freshwater Trust to use your program or your technology called BasinScout. And I was blown away, obviously, with the technology, but perhaps even more blown away by your team and how just unbelievably smart, unbelievably focused, really, really high level communicators, able to take extremely complex ideas and boil them down into things that even a dumbass like me can understand. And so give the listeners a crash course in BasinScout, because I think talking about one specific technology is a good way to illustrate just kind of overall what y'all are doing.
Yeah. So first off, I gotta acknowledge the team. The people that are attracted to what we're doing are just phenomenal people. I mean, they're mind-blowingly phenomenal people.
Yes.
And in every aspect of their life, certainly they're better versions of me than me, on the job. And then they do, they're running ultra marathons or, collecting endangered coral in their spare time. I mean, it's like unbelievably great people. And the way that I did figure out a while ago that the way that you bring good people on and you attract them is that really you've got 3 options. The first option is pay them a ton of dough, right? Like an exorbitant amount of dough. And we try to pay well, but it's nothing like, kind of actors in, other parts of our economy.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not that. You can market the heck out of it and make them feel like they're cool. Like, sort of take the Nike approach and just make it awesome. And we don't really take that approach. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, you're the coolest outfit I've never heard of. So it's not that. And the one where we do bring them in is we give them an honest shot at solving a very difficult problem that must be solved. And that we have in spades. And so that's why, I kind of, I look at these people and, we have built a culture of, we're not crazy, but, we're deeply committed to solving this issue. And it's a whole suite of issues, but, just because we've come up against something that we don't understand, that doesn't mean we can't solve it. We've now come up against a bunch of things that we don't understand, and we just outwork it.
Yeah.
And, the BasinScout's origin is sort of rooted in that. And, kind of, these are most of the people on our staff, they're really technical, but they have a really applied bent to them. And they do like the idea that we are, we live like, we do technology, but it toggles to the physical world. And that's sort of, if you look at all the pretty legal words and policy words written on paper and all of the cool programs that are out there in the world and drawn up, they don't necessarily go all the way to the ground. And we very much view that our job is that toggle. We are building that toggle line between all of those big ideas and then how it really goes down on the ground for real people and real lands. So I'll give you the shorthand of, BasinScout, which, all of our scientists cringe when I say it, but, the shorthand is like, we figured out how to X-ray nature, right? So we take, a lot of data, and we put it together, and you ultimately, you find answers, right? Or you find options. And then we like to express those in maps. So we can sort through 30 million acres to find the 10,000 acres that matter within a basin for a given kind of water quality parameter or water quantity parameter. And so then if you can find those, 10,000 needles in a 30 million needle haystack, right? Or a 30 million, whatever, you get the point.
Yeah.
You've shrunk the problem, and effectively you've shrunk the price of fixing the problem. So, we go in and say, who is managing those lands? What do they need to move from, the way they have been operating to the way they could be operating? And because we have been able to quantify environmental uplift into tradable units, like, we can make transactions happen. So it's not just a matter of doing a project and the project is done and the end. It's not that you have created a 20-acre wetland. It's how much phosphorus can a 20-acre wetland situated here at the end of this irrigation pipe filter out day over day, month over month, year over year? Precisely how many pounds? Are we talking about 3 pounds for $1 million? Or are we talking about 3,000 pounds annually for $1 million? And so we can identify which actions are basically the greatest environmental uplift for the least amount of cost. And what that does is it shrinks the problem. So in BasinScout was, we conceived of, Streambank, and the patent came later on, but we conceived of Streambank in like 2004. And, and basically if you use a computer and, the machinery of a computer to identify high uplift projects within a basin and you quantify the environmental uplift from that, and somebody purchases that for, to either offset their mitigation or to, to satisfy their mission, whether like if it was a funding agency, or a philanthropist, and they paid for it that way. That's our patent, right? That's, and that's sort of that. It's not that the patent opens up, the opportunities. It just protects your rights later on if you wanted to monetize it. But and kick posers off, of course.
Yeah.
But the case study, one of our first case studies was we were working with a town down in Southern Oregon on the Rogue River that about 100,000 people, and they had a temperature issue on the road, because all municipalities have temperature issues, because when you treat water, you generally will heat it up to clean it up. And you have to cool that water, particularly where it returns within the watershed, right? Before you send it back. So in salmon country, where we had listed several of the first Pacific salmon under the Endangered Species Act, we were the ones driving, or in part responsible for driving lower temperatures, because high temperatures for fish can stop their migration patterns. It can interrupt their life stages and so forth. And so you have to deal with it. But they were going to, at that point, I think they had a bid to dig a hole and pump the water in and let it sit there and then pump the water back out. And that was at a price tag of somewhere between $16 and $20 million. And the unit of trade was 300 million kilocalories per day, which sounds like a lot, but it's significant, but it's not sort of insurmountable. We were able to figure out that if we did targeted plantings to cover entire tributaries with canopy shade, that we could cool the system at a rate of 600 million kilocalories per day for a cost of $6 million. And so, you got to remember, local city councils are they don't really care. They don't care about, well, I shouldn't say they don't care about the fish or the environment. They do, but their job is to get the city in compliance and make sure that their water isn't a pollutant under the Clean Water Act. So they have to permit that, but they really okay, so I'm in compliance and it saves me money. Done. Right. And, we worked with the, EPA and the Department of Environmental Quality, did everything according to Hoyle, did that. And we got the contract. And there was I think a typical not-for-profit says, we're rich. I think at that time, $6 million was probably bigger than our operating budget. It may have been, I don't know. I'd have to go back. But the reality is, with the technology, we're you know what? I mean, you should never plant trees. If you want to cool the watershed, don't plant trees on a north bank. Mm-hmm. There is no, the number one sort of creator of temperature problems in any watershed is the sun.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're not blocking the sun, you're not doing anything. And so we were what we need to do is we need to figure out how to go out and get maximum kilocalories for least cost. Let's do that. And, we're GIS jocks, go to work, and, we're delineating parcels and figuring out, aspect and slope, and trying to figure out which tributaries are the ones that are the most crucial and how we can keep corridors going. And anyway, we're what we can do is the contract's for $6 million for an outcome. It's not just, paid and you're done. So if we spend $4 million on this, we can take the margin and till it into more conservation work here. Because what we were after is biological response at the end of the day. Not just there is no doubt that we could grow into a monster of a consulting firm. If our only outcome was to grow and make money, we could do that. But once we get the process down, we throw it over the shoulder. Anybody can do that now. We have to keep leaning into the forward space here. But we did do that. We made a deal with the city and said, look, if we if we hit your number early, how about we split the difference? We'll, the remaining on the contract, you get half and we get half. And they're like, great. So we got the incentives all set up.
That's cool.
And then we started getting other funders to go in there because we're starting to think about this, again, for biological response. We did not list those fish to put them on a list and just become a big green wall of no.
Mm-hmm.
As we understood the act, the Endangered Species Act, when it's operating properly, should be aligned on recovering the species. And, with regard to fish, I mean, they use entire watersheds. So, and watersheds operate like a mosaic, right? Some of it's hammered, most of it's hammered, all of it's compromised or altered, and a bit of it is in great shape, right? But so we went in and, we took different colors of money from different agencies and different foundations. And we were able to do some things in some targeted areas where we could not only do the planting, but also do large, like log jams, right?
Yeah.
And those are like big fish hotels for spawning and rearing. And we lease some water in stream to, get the water temperature down and make it more available at different times of the year during migration and spawning. And then also, fenced out the cows. And we did, like, everybody was compensated. Everybody's happy about that. And year over year, those fish, and they were, listed species, they basically bounced back, was something like 300%, 600%, north of 1,000% year over year. And we're like, that's it.
That's
crazy. This is it. Like, so we're like, this is how we do this. We have to do enough good work in a short enough period of time in the right places, and then we can get the biological response that we need. That is how we can recover species and add, resilience into watersheds. And it turns out, like, now that we're figuring out that landowners can be made more economically prosperous in several different ways. And they're the ones that control the land, and they can certainly control the water. And so this is how we proceed. And so that has been, we've been motivated for a long time, but that has animated our efforts over the last several years, because we now feel like, okay, we figured out the technology, we figured out the science. We now have to figure out the finance piece so that it doesn't take 3 years to get an irrigation upgrade done. It doesn't take, 7 grant writing episodes, within a nonprofit or, an RCD, a rural conservation district, or, others. We can if we can focus on outcomes and smooth out the finance of this massively fragmented funding system, we can, at a sort of a basin scale, at a watershed level, begin to solve our water problems, and which happens to solve our land problems, which solves our ag problems, which solves our drought problems, which solves our community problems. It's sort of it's all connected. And so I think when we saw that, the ability to X-ray is not in itself a fix. If that broken femur is like, yeah, you got a broken leg, and, the end of story, right? Yeah. That's not enough. You have to have the right tools. You have to have an ability to operate, and complete the surgery, to complete the recovery and move on. And so that has been, just kind of an organizing piece of it, but it was just a piece of it. The bigger thing is, and I think this is the coolest part about the technology, because it represents in maps. Everybody just intuitively understands maps.
Sure.
And, you do different schemes, sometimes do red, yellow, green. That's, people don't like to see red on their property. Especially when, they're like, people have been long worried about, this is agricultural producers long worried about, regulation coming over the hill in the form of a black UN helicopter, right?
Yeah.
But you can see, look, you have a great opportunity here, and this makes you, because 3 of the 12 fields that you run are, eligible for this. You sign up here, and then we get you what you need. That's a very different setup than what we have had heretofore. And I think the other thing is we don't like the stakeholder processes that happen. I mean, we don't need a lot more stakeholder processes. We don't need a lot more pilots. We know what to do. We just have to be able to have the tools to action the solution. And what's been really cool is seeing people they go into problem solving mode. Whereas in stakeholder things, they pretend like they're in problem solving mode for the first 2/3 of it. And then when real decisions start to get made, everybody goes back to their foxhole.
Yeah.
And, lobs grenades, and you get, you move a couple steps forward or a couple steps backwards or a couple steps sideways, and everybody, says they did it, but nothing has changed. And mapping with the people that, will operate in that basin, it just changes everything. It kind of de-escalates that. And, if you have a basin-wide game plan, people can snap in wherever they're at. I mean, we have work to do, going forward. If we can have nonprofits that are, sort of really good at getting public grant money, are still wasting time, right? Mm-hmm. It takes most nonprofits spend, certainly half of their time raising the money to do the work. And if we can get it so that there are, if you have a game plan, you've x-rayed a basin and it needs to happen. And there's a bunch of different things that need to happen to add form and function to a watershed while also providing known economic benefit to operators and growers. It's like pieces of puzzle. Anybody can snap in, and, it would never, how great would it be to never have to write another grant, but do more work than you've ever done organizationally. And that's the kind of thing that technology can help us achieve. And we just have to shift. One big shift that has to happen is, environmentalism 1.0 was all about procedure. It was procedure-based action, right? We somebody had to, we were sliding down the mountain, and that was the best ice axe that we could pull out of our backpack.
Yeah.
And it needed to happen, but now it kind of has sort of, it's stalled. We still have to get to the top of the mountain, mm-hmm. right? So we can't just stay here. And so, getting focused on the outcomes, and then having the feds, purchase environmental outcomes in a principled way. So, we know that, people are performing the criteria certain when they, build a wetland or improve an irrigation system. Those are the things that we have to be able to do for us all to win.
That's one of the things I really admire about you and your whole team, is this focus on action and on getting things accomplished versus talking. I mean, obviously there's a ton of talking that needs to happen and a ton of analysis, but I mean, I feel like every time I was on a call with your team, we get off and things would actually happen. Whereas I think it's far too common that people just talk, and then that leads to more talk, and it leads to more talk, and nobody actually ever does anything. And it drives me insane. And I think I told you this when we talked the other day. You were talking about how awesome your team is. And when I first was introduced to most of them, I think it was April of 2020. And so, COVID had come down and everybody was trying to get their footing. And I remember there were 2 or 3 people on the call from your team that had tents set up in their backyard.
I mean, it's sometimes
they're wearing coats.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But they were psyched, man. They were psyched, and they were leaning in, and that whole tool that they helped us create has gone on to help it's just really just the beginning, but it's helping these decision makers figure out how to make the most important decisions that is not just for the environment, it's for the community, for the economy. I mean, across the board. And so anyway, I appreciate y'all's help. One more question about the organization. I feel like getting to know you, the organization is, in a lot of ways, it seems to reflect a lot of your personal values. And I was looking on your website, and you have 5 different core values that I loved and identified with. And I think that they're great for whether you're talking about running a business or just running your day-to-day life. But how much of the organization would you say is a reflection of your personal values versus kind of a melding of the values of all these amazing people who work there?
Well, it's a course of melding. I mean, I didn't just sit down and draft these things up. We didn't do that until like the 20 teens, when we were starting to grow, and we needed to convey kind of, the great place, the great place and the great kind of culture that we've created. And, there was a time, and I'm not cartooning this by much, when we were growing and doing our very earliest innovating, our onboarding was really not much more than, "Hi, I'm Joe. There's your backpack. We got to get to the top of that hill as soon as you can. See you there." And I mean, I'm cartooning it not by much. And there were a lot of people, the people that liked that, and that were just like, "That's awesome. Perfect. I'll see you. In fact, I'll beat you."
Yeah.
Those people flourished. The people that said, "Where's the personnel handbook? Where's the this?" They didn't do well. They bounced off.
Yep.
We had Stanford MBAs that were like, "No, we can't do this." We're like, "Okay." And, over time there became a critical mass. And we do have a bias toward action. I think that a lot of it is like people bring their personalities to work, and they're just, it's a culture of goers in many ways, and they're very good at whatever it is that they're doing within the organization. And we do have a lot of opportunities where, we like, look, you're a wet scientist. Okay, come over here, and you don't know how to code, but we need you to figure out how to code to do this. And I know you've never seen these set of circumstances, but, we find people are creative in unknown places. And so, and a big part of those core values come down to what it is. I mean, at the end of the day, it's what we expect of ourselves and what we expect of others. Like, one of my favorite core values was articulated in, you have to, like, especially in this distributed workplace, we have to have this. You got to give the benefit of the doubt to your colleagues,
yes.
Right? You don't get on this ride just because, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like and so when you get on this ride with us, there are things that are expected of you. And I meet with everybody that comes on board and try, give them a little bit of our origin story. And I impress upon them that the most important amount of time is right in front of them. They're walking into us with a clear lens, and it's as clear as it's ever going to be these next 6-9 months before you drink the Kool-Aid and, you're completely biased toward action like all of us. But between now and then,
mm-hmm.
we need you, and you have full license to stand up and say, "I think you're doing this wrong."
That's cool.
And we need you to do that. Now, the colleagues that you are now walking into, it is a given that they have to have they have to be open to hearing that. And now you got to defend it. Like, you can't just sort of raise your hand and say that sucks and then leave. Like, then we go, tell us why, give us an answer. Like, where do we go from here? If this is not good, what do we do? And that, we put that out there very late. I've been doing that for years, and we have to have an environment, and it's very difficult in our growing and distributed workforce to do that over a screen. The screens, drive me crazy. It's a lot easier in person, but we played advantage during COVID, and we were like, yeah, you don't have to move. Like, we were pretty remote anyway. Like, people are out in the field, they're running around. Like, we weren't, we had an office, but we didn't use it all that. We had several offices. We didn't use them all that time. But if you're not giving us everything in your head, then you are hurting us, right? We can't figure this out. It takes a lot of smart people, running in overdrive most of the time to do what we're trying to do. And we can't hold anything back. So, the core values, I'm a part of it, but this is an us thing. And I can't tell you how cool it is to now, after all these years, have been a part of building something that, our goal is never to become a huge not-for-profit.
Yeah.
Right. That's not our goal. We have to, it's not the easiest business plan to execute on, because as soon as you figure out to create innovation and anybody can do it, then hand it off to anybody that can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we have to lean back. We have to continue to walk toward the sun. And that makes it very hard. But it's the right thing to do, because, we've now gone through 50 years plus of, sort of modern environmentalism, and you know what? It's not getting it done. And that's not just in environment. Like, that also happens to be true in education, and
it does.
Healthcare, and, senior living, pick your hot button. For a long time, we thought in the United States that we could somehow outrun the storm front by, putting our foot on the gas, but we can't outrun these problems. Are so big and so vast that we have to accelerate and, kind of have a function change in a pretty fundamental way. And so our job, and this is not the last time, say we outrun the storm somehow, right?
Yep.
There's more coming. There are going to be different problems. And what we want to do at the Freshwater Trust, not just today, but going forward, is we want that bias toward action. And impact is mass times velocity. You don't need mass if you have enough velocity.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really about being able to move rapidly across an uncertain terrain with, safety. It's kind of like the Baja 500 or whatever. It's kind of like that type of an operation that we have to stay committed to, because the innovation, the piece on the front end is the most important piece. Once we can, like I say, work with partners and have them do the work, that's awesome. Like, that's exactly what we want to do. And we have to make it easy, and we can provide, we hope that we can provide the technology. And, one dream is to be able to provide, sort of outcomes banking accounts, so that if you are a not-for-profit or a landowner or a regulating agency or a funding agency or foundation or corporation that needs mitigation, that you can go out and fix the problem that you have, and not be slowed down by transaction costs, because we can automate almost all of those transaction costs at this. We societally can do that. We just have not done it because the system is now ingrained and ensconced a little bit more than it needs to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that speaks, your approach with that. It speaks to having kind of obviously confidence, but also like an abundance mindset. Thinking, not this is mine. We're the only ones that can do it. It's like, look, our dream is for other people to do it. Then we'll go do something else. Before we started recording, we all of a sudden we were talking about history books, and so it's clear that you're a big reader, and I'd love to know if you have a few books that have played a role. They don't necessarily have to be about conservation or history or anything, but just, are there any books that have been important to you in your journey, both professionally and personally?
Yeah, I think a few different ones. Water perspective, I think, Beyond the 100th Meridian by Stegner was of that one. I was like, holy smokes. That's why we have square states.
Yeah. Isn't that
out
crazy?
west and squiggly states back east. And I was like, holy smokes. That really kind of opened up a lot to me that was hidden before. I think the best water book that I've seen, in recent years is The Dreamt Land by Mark Arax, which he's out of it's California's history, and it is mind blowing with water. Kind of the ones that really kind of changed how I understood, that I refer back to over and over again, is the sort of Good to Great series by Jim Collins.
Oh yeah.
The hedgehog concept, where, what can you do in the world that you're the best at? And, what do you care deeply about, and what drives your resource engine? Staying in the center of that Venn diagram provides you strength organizationally. And then the flywheel concept is something that is really taking on new prominence in what we're doing. But, I think that stems back to, I did that tour of duty with the consulting gig, and I just saw so many organizations run, by people straight out of the 70s. No offense to people straight out of the 70s, but they were literally and figuratively, sort of doing this shaman approach. And it's like, and what I mean by that is they can tell you what time it is, like you've never heard time told before, these leaders, but they're not much for building clocks, and organizations are just clocks. And, between that training and this writing, I'm like, his whole series is pretty fascinating. If you turn it on yourself and your organization, is pretty fantastic. The 15-5 that Yvonne Chenard used, that I learned about in Paul Hawkins' book, Building a Business. Pretty fascinating. And we use that as one of our management tools, and still do today. Those 5 questions at the end of the week takes you 15 minutes to write them and 5 minutes to read them. And exactly where the things that matter are. That was a great little bit. And then, the book that that was given to me when we were going through some hard times, like The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday.
That's a great one.
And you talked a lot about, kind of, you gave me some unwarranted compliments, but, the 4 virtues of Stoicism are like courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And, no matter what happens to you can basically run yourself through those filters, and, not being afraid and doing the right thing, not necessarily the justice system, but like having the courage to not be afraid. Like, don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to have the conversation. Do the right thing at all scales to all people, and, temperance, that balance is like, you don't want to be too courageous. You don't want to be, too justice focused. You got to do the right amount. Sort of that, the wisdom to know that there is understanding, when and how. Those are big things there. And I think I was kind of living like that, but it was really nice to see that. And I give that book to people that are in the shit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if they're going through something that is hard, and by the way, it doesn't work with kids that blow their ACL. Turned out they need more time to think about it. Like, thanks, Dad. Get lost. But that, and then cool books like The Accidental Connoisseur is a must read. We live out here in Willamette Valley, Peanut Country, and, it was all over my head. And, It was written by Lawrence Osborne, but it was, it's like, an irreverent journey through wine world is really good. But one must read, and I think we talked about this last time, the American Nation's History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America by Colin Woodard.
Oh, yeah.
That is just, I read that probably in the last 6 months. Just a fantastic, look at kind of how we got here. It goes from, pre Plymouth Rock to Obama, and kind of how we and our various cultures migrated across the country, and what that meant for our politics and our economies, for our educational systems. It's just really, really cool. If you want to understand people, that's a pretty interesting look.
I've not read that one. And so all those will be in the episode notes. So people listening, if you're driving or something, don't be writing these down. You can click through. So last question for you. We're recording this in November. I think it'll come out right after Thanksgiving. And end of the year, I would encourage people to go to the Freshwater Trust website and donate. But where would you direct people to go to learn more about the organization, kind of get involved, to, just be connected and dig in even deeper to everything y'all are doing?
It's the freshwatertrust.org is obviously the place to go. But if you got a really burning question, you can click on my face and hit me up.
Awesome. Well, man, I'm so glad this happened. This was has been in the works for quite a while, and I've just heard so many awesome things about you, and obviously know so much great stuff about Freshwater Trust. And I feel like we're going to need to do a part 2 at some point. Maybe if I'm out that way, we'll sit down and do this in person. But I really, really appreciate it. Keep up the great work, and I'm really glad to know you.
Ed, you're the greatest of all time. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number 1, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number 2, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.